Hey there. It's go big or go home right now in Silicon Valley. Big tech is getting, well, even bigger. The race to dominate the artificial intelligence boom is an expensive one, and it's spawning all sorts of investment deals and takeovers. But is that a good thing? Is big tech already too big? And if so, what, if anything, can be done about it? Let's try and find out. I'm Carmel Crimmins, and this is Reuters Econ World. Every week we go deep on the economic principles and ideas driving the biggest news around the world. On this week's show, Big Tech. Big Tech is called that for a reason. Just a handful of US companies dominate our everyday lives. They feed us information and products, keep us connected and entertained. They also account for much of the US stock market and are an increasingly important driver of US economic growth. My guest today describes them as digital platforms, and he warns that they are extracting wealth and deepening inequality. Tim Wu is a leading scholar on tech regulation and a professor at Columbia Law School. He helped the Biden administration craft its antitrust policies, and he's also the author of a new book called The Age of Extraction. Welcome, Tim. Thanks so much for joining us on the show today.
Sure, pleasure to be here.
Tim, it's Economics 101 that monopolies are bad. Are they always a bad thing?
I think the presumption is they're a bad thing. I can think of small exceptions where that might be different. Sometimes it's unavoidable. The electric system, maybe in a town, it's hard to imagine having three different providers. But yeah, generally, I think the presumption is if you have one company with no discipline on them, they tend to drift towards stagnation and bad things and overextraction.
How do you define a monopoly?
I think I have a traditional definition, which is a dominant firm that I think the essence is that they don't face significant discipline. So in other words, they can price the way they want. They can bully people around. They don't really face significant challenges from others. I think that is the essence of it, is a lack of discipline.
I mean, Peter Thiel famously said that competition is for losers, right? That monopoly should be the goal. What do you make of that? You create your own market, you're such a draw that you're the only player in town, kind of like Facebook was, like back in the day.
I can understand why business would want to do that. The question is whether that's the world you want to live in. His manual made a lot of sense, I guess. In the same way you might say every politician should aim to be a dictator. You could see why that would be good for them. Who wants to be bothered with voters and things like that? But similarly, it's just not good for the country or for the world to be dominated by monopolists.
Does big tech, as it stands now, does it fit the bill of a monopoly?
I think many of the big tech firms do in their segments. Google has obviously dominated search for a long time and has few challengers. Amazon dominates online marketplaces. Facebook has family and friends marketing. At the edges, they all face competition, and we're probably going to talk about AI at some point. But I think on the classic economic definition, they each have at least one market that they dominate. Microsoft, Windows, other example. Yeah.
Sitting here in Europe, we often think that actually over in, we're always told Silicon Valley, America, it's a very dynamic place. It is a very dynamic economy, particularly when you compare it to Western Europe. In a way, isn't that kind of drive to be the monopoly power, to be that great success, to have no competitors? Isn't that what, in a way, drives innovation in Silicon Valley?
I think that things have changed. So I think Silicon Valley in the 80s and 90s was a different place than it is today. Silicon Valley in the 80s and 90s was a kind of outsider place. I think the aspiration was to build great companies, good companies, but monopoly wasn't necessarily the primary motive. It was supposed to be more about like tech than about becoming a billionaire. They were supposed to distrust government as opposed to wanting to be government contractors like they all do today. I think that's a new idea. I think it's a Peter Thiel idea. I think the older version, let's say Intel era, or let's say Sun or Apple era, was, hey, we want to build a really cool machine, not we want to dominate our industry, become billionaires and bully other people. It has sort of undergone this almost Nietzsche-like transformation where they're all trying to become the Ubermensch, when in the 70s they were trying to build cool companies. And so I think Silicon Valley was more dynamic in the 70s and 80s, built more important software, at least for humanity, even if it created less individual wishes. And I guess I'm sticking on this, but the motivation was different. It wasn't just about, okay, I'm going to become a monopoly and dominate everyone. It's like, I'm going to invent something really cool, and that I will be remembered for that.
Why did that mentality change, do you think?
I mean, basically, this is what I chronicle in the book, is I think there has been a profound ideological transformation in Silicon Valley that really, I guess, turned with the rise of the platform and the ideology of monopoly. I guess I'd say that Silicon Valley is no longer an outsider, rebellious kind of place, like the famous Steve Jobs rebellion against the IBM monopoly, and became more of a place obsessed with money and power, just like everybody else.
Okay, quiz time. J.D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil controlled around 90% of American oil refineries, and according to some estimates, would have been worth over $1 trillion in today's money. In a landmark ruling in 1911, the Supreme Court ordered that the company be dissolved and divided into 39 different entities. So which of the following companies was born out of Standard Oil's breakup? Is it A, Chevron, B, ExxonMobil, or C, ConocoPhillips? I'll have the answer for you at the end of the show. Up next, how Silicon Valley firms became so big. Tim, can you explain what you mean by platform power? It's at the heart of your thesis, isn't it, about the power of big tech?
Yeah. So, when we think about economic power and you think about monopoly, I think the traditional vision people have is like a company that has, say, monopolized the sale of footwear or something, or ball bearings. That's a source of their power. The ascendant form of power in the 21st century is platform power. And that is the power that comes from being the host to and the connector of very large groups, both of citizens, individuals, consumers, and sellers, or I guess commercial entities on the other side. And somewhere in the 90s, early 20th century, more and more people started to realize that the platform is where the real power lies in the economy. I give Bill Gates a lot of credit for being the one, in some sense, to discover this. He realized with his Windows that he could, in some ways, be the master of the ecosystem and start to take the most valuable and useful parts of the ecosystem and make them his. And that's a model followed ultimately by all the major tech platforms of our time, that they are the interconnectors between two different big groups of people, and that's the source of their power.
There was a lot of optimism, wasn't there, that about the internet and how it would elevate the little guy. What happened?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the reasons I wrote this book was to try to understand or track down what happened to the promise that the internet was going to make everybody rich, and in some ways what went wrong. Because there was a strong belief, and it was centered on the same platform philosophy, that we were coming into an age where, everyone with a hobby would be able to sell their products and become millionaires, that small businesses would thrive, that everyone with talent would be able to find an audience. And I think some of that has been true. But what was wrong was that the proceeds would be kept by the sellers. And this is why platform power is so important to understanding our economy today. As it turned out, the middlemen got all the money. And that they understood that once they had, in a sense, captured, I'll use a little technical jargon, both sides of their platform market. In other words, once they had a place like Amazon Marketplace, had all the sellers and had all the buyers in one place, that they could take more and more and more of the share of the proceeds. And, that dream, it took a while, but in small ways has been betrayed.
But Tim, there is competition still out there, isn't there? I mean, we saw last year a judge ruling that Meta isn't a social media monopoly, right? Because competition has come along in the form of TikTok. Technology has evolved. We've got YouTube now. I mean, there is still competition out there.
Yeah, I wouldn't say there's no competition. I happen to think the judge got that wrong.
Okay.
Based on the fact that Facebook has kept its solid hold on friends and family social networking, like going to see what your friends and family have to say about a certain issue or whatever, versus other forms like TikTok, which are more like an alternative form of entertainment. And I would say even in somewhat monopolized markets, there's always some competition, but I think we have a low level of competition, and I think a suboptimal level of competition where mainly it is about a couple of big platforms and what are they going to do. And like I'm talking about the old days, but the 80s and 90s, there were a few big companies. There was Microsoft, but there were hundreds of companies. And the question is, what's new? What's next? Who's going to upset who? And now I mean, if you think we're not living in a world where it's basically about, five or six big companies, what are they going to do? I mean, you got to be dreaming. And I just think that's a profoundly different type of industrial reality, and one which I think, particularly over the long run, is unhealthy.
So how so is it unhealthy? Like, talk us through what you see as the risks to having these big
Yeah.
digital platforms.
Yeah. So I think there's a few things that are risky about an economy, a tech economy dominated by a small number of players. The first is for tech itself. With a small number of players, you have fewer bets and more centralized decision making. Right now, all of the tech platforms, almost imitatively, are betting on AI. It might be a very good bet. It could be that they're under betting on other things because we just have so few companies making the big investment decisions. So there's a centralization of decision making, which most, I think, theory suggests can be very dangerous. The second, I think, problem is over time, you tend in industries with just a few players to have a stagnation effect as they become afraid to do anything that destroys their main revenue streams. So, you'll notice that Google, for example, never developed AI in a form that would challenge its advertising revenue, and has sort of grudgingly been forced into that by some competition, which I think has been good. They tend to get stuck in their business model and not move from it. Now, big tech platforms are still relatively new, but if you look at older industries, I think a good example being the U.S. aerospace industry, they've sort of been stuck in a rut anchored by Boeing for the last 20, 30 years or so, and they moved to more incremental innovation patterns. The third problem, and it's a problem with monopoly and market power more generally, is the small number of companies extract too much from the rest of the ecosystem and contribute to problems of inequality or just centralized wealth. And I think that in the long run leads to social instability, political instability, anger, in even more extreme versions, times like the 1930s or late 19th centuries led to revolution and war. So we're not quite there, although frankly, we do live in a much less stable society today, politically and economically. And I think that has a lot to do, not just with the tech sector, but the entire tendency of having concentrated wealth in a small number of individuals and firms that creates enormous amounts of resentment.
What's the solution as you see it? What would you do?
For one thing, I'm a strong believer in basic antitrust and anti-monopoly enforcement, that you at least have to make sure that the big tech platforms are not able to further insulate themselves by doing things like buying their competitors, by doing things like just setting up very obvious barriers to new companies coming into the space. Another thing that I really think we need to think about, Europe has taken more steps in this area, but frankly has, in my view, been too weak about it. In some parts of the ecosystem, we need to ask whether some of the platforms have become as essential as utilities. I remember I talked about the electric system
Yeah.
earlier.
hmm
And I think most of us agree that if you had no rules for the electric networks, electric utilities, that would be a bad thing. They would, charge whatever they wanted. I just think it would wreak havoc. I think we've reached the point in maturity where some of the platform services look more like utilities. And this is very abstract, but let me give you an example like Amazon Marketplace. Amazon Marketplace has transformed from a place that made a lot of people rich to one that is primarily making Amazon rich. And it's because they're taking more than brick and mortar. So I mean, I've been surprised that Europe hasn't been more active about this situation, that there hasn't been more of an effort to try to, basically put some limits on Amazon's take one way or another, or at least prevent it from advertising its own product or selling its own products on its own marketplace.
If money and finance is your thing, we've got you covered. Our sister pod, Reuters Morning Bid, is your go-to market briefing 7 days a week. All you need to do is go to your favourite podcast player or ask your smart speaker for Reuters Morning Bid to get that market edge straight from the experts in our newsroom. And if you'd rather watch along, we've got a video version for you too. In the next part of the show, we look at how the AI race is shaking things up. You mentioned the race to, the AI race. How has that shaken things up? The race to be the dominant player in that space?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the AI race has been extraordinarily important. One of the positive offshoots, I think, of so much antitrust attention is that it's given a little room for OpenAI to get a runway to get started and challenge Google most obviously. So I think that's been very important. I think Google, under the watch of antitrust authorities, was not able to edge out OpenAI, make everything Gemini, which I think if they would have, they could have. So that's made a big difference. The big question that I think is not getting asked enough is whether AI is really going to be a challenge to the current tech platforms, or whether it is going to be used to reinforce their power. And that, frankly, is like the trillion-dollar question in terms of industrial policy, industrial history. But as I said, somewhat neglected question.
I mean, sort of the spending that's happening, right, in this AI race is huge. And we are seeing it sort of help drive US economic growth. Is there a risk that if you go after big tech at this juncture, it'll damage US economic growth?
I think that no company should be allowed to hold policy hostage to the theory that they're spending money. Actually, frankly, this spending is in the midst of antitrust attention, right? So there's always this kind of, this is in the midst of an enormous amount. And if anything, the whole idea of antitrust enforcement is to force companies to innovate and force companies into competition, force them to spend money on things like developing new products. So frankly, antitrust can put companies in a position where they have to spend as opposed to the opposite, because it's a lot easier if you're a monopolist not to spend your money, to hoard it and try to just defend yourself. So I take the exact opposite view on that.
I mean, obviously this is a global, the AI race is a global one, right? China is obviously heavily invested in the space as well. China tends to promote its own national champions. So again, would there be a risk if you sort of go after US big tech as it sort of vies with Chinese companies?
I think that history strongly suggests that if you want to win an international race, the best thing to do is force your domestic companies to compete. The US has taken different approaches over its history. So have Europe and Japan. A good example is in the 70s, the national champion of the United States was IBM. What did the US do? It tried to break it up. What did that lead to? It led to Apple, Microsoft, Sun, a new generation of companies. It kind of stands to reason that strong companies usually come out of domestic competition. And if you want companies that have no domestic competition, they're not going to do so well. I mean, the great US national champions have been General Motors and Boeing, which have mainly been insulated from antitrust attention. And I got to say, the track record of those companies is not great. So the basic lesson is it's almost like an athlete who's training. Imagine you were training someone for the Olympics and you said, oh, we have our boxer.
Mm-hmm.
We can't have him fight because he's got to wait for the Olympics. Well, what's going to happen? He's going to, stagnate, get fat, and be unable to win when it comes to the world stage. So the US system has always worked best when they force the best companies to continue to face competition instead of sitting back on their laurels.
Tim, is China doing things differently?
Yeah, I think they are. It's crazy to think that China might take a more decentralized approach, but I think it's true. If you think about the US and China and their approaches to the future right now, The US is basically all in on AI and to some degree crypto technology. Those are like our bets on the future in terms of dollars. And we've scaled back our bets on things like clean energy, batteries, and so on. China has taken a very different approach. Obviously, there's a lot of investment in AI
Hmm.
as well, but there's also enormous investments in electric vehicles, having a kind of a charging grid, batteries, solar. They've kind of taken a more diversified bet on what the future might be. Now, maybe they're wrong, and maybe the U.S. is right, but the U.S. is, in my view, if this was like, a roulette table, we put in $300 billion on black, and maybe that's
Right.
right.
But maybe
But
it's not.
maybe if AI turns out to be, it is incredibly
Yeah.
impressive. I use AI all the time, but maybe it is like reaches some limit in terms of its total utility, and then we're way behind in the rest of the technologies of the future. So that I think is a risk of the current U.S. approach.
If you like this podcast, why not subscribe to the newsletter that accompanies it? Also called Reuters Econ World, it spotlights our best coverage of finance and economics, and it's published straight to your inbox every Thursday. We've put a link to the sign-up in the description to today's show. In the final part of this episode, we look at how the Trump administration is dealing with big tech. Tim, what was it like taking on big tech in the Biden administration?
It had its ups and downs, I guess. There was a lot of internal disagreement inside the government. I was there twice during the Obama administration and during the Biden administration. And inside the Obama administration, frankly, we sort of had a very positive view of the tech companies, even as we started to worry about their increasing monopolization of the sectors. The Biden administration, in contrast, there had been a turn. The president himself was very concerned about the effect of big tech on American democracy, particularly social media. Frankly, he was right about that as things have continued to deteriorate. So it felt like we were in a very difficult fight, but one that felt like the right fight. I am a person who's of the belief that in any age, the greatest threat comes from uncontrolled power. And, there's various forms of that. Sometimes government is uncontrolled power. Nothing should be able to immunize themselves from scrutiny. And, tech has a minimum level of scrutiny, and that's what I think we are engaged in.
Is the Trump administration a friend or a foe of big tech? What's your take?
That is the greatest question. I mean, when they started
Mm,
back in 2016,
right. The first Trump administration, you mean? Yeah.
yeah, the first Trump administration, they were a foe, I guess. They brought many of the antitrust cases that were continued, including that Facebook case that you mentioned earlier. Um, I think the Republican base has a very strong populist side. And, they felt the extraction very straightforwardly. I think they feel the economy has been tilted against basically the center of the country. This administration, the second Trump administration, has really been a confusing mixture because they still have all these cases. I mean,
Hmm.
it's almost forgotten, but there is a case against Amazon, a case against Apple,
Yep.
uh, that are kind of going on in the background. If you're someone who only read law reports, you'd say, oh, well, this is a very anti-big tech administration. But if you looked at the White House and their dinners and the hanging out and foreign policy, you have the opposite impression. The Trump administration is sort of a different thing every day. I hate to say it, but it's the most obvious guide to it is who is pandering most to the president and who's agreeing to pay them off. And unfortunately, tech has become much more inclined towards the classic path of just trying to pay off government, something that they themselves despised in their origins.
Have you been surprised that some of those big cases haven't been dropped?
A little. Now, I also, and everyone knows, the Trump administration loves to have some kind of cudgel to threaten people with. So maybe that's part of it. Maybe there's also a sense, in the Trump administration, they fear if they pander too much to big tech, that ultimately the base will revolt. I think Republican base is suspicious and feels the big tech takes too much money from the economy. But the Trump administration's at the top, not at the bottom, seems to be playing along with what they want. So, at some point, you break from your base too far, and the floor begins to collapse.
Because certainly outside, when it comes to M&A, it seems like it's go-go, right? Deals are surging generally under Trump 2.0, right? Wall Street is really, seizing the initiative because it feels like they're not going to get the sort of antitrust hammer coming down on them.
It's really yet to be seen what's going to happen. I mean, to move a little bit to the related field of media, although Netflix is a tech company, well, we haven't seen how this plays out yet, but as your listeners know, Netflix is trying to acquire Warner Brothers. And I think there's a strong case that is going to be challenged. So rumors of merger law's demise are perhaps exaggerated. I do think, judging from some of the mergers we've seen, that the role of government favoritism seems to be stronger. I'll put it that way. And it does seem to be much more of a question of who can, talk to the right people. But to say it's gone is, I think, incorrect. And Wall Street might be making some mistakes in that respect.
For everyday people, how does this all affect them? Like the rise of the big tech, where they are right now in terms of their power?
Yeah, I mean, we spoke earlier about monopoly. And I think one thing you can expect with monopoly is that your products will tend to get worse over time. And I think if you think about most of the internet's main applications, to use a phrase that my friend Cory Doctorow coined, they've become shitified. I think you have more ads, higher fees, less easy usability for most of our main internet products. I mean, Facebook is constantly bombarding me with all kinds of stuff I don't want to see. Twitter has gone downhill. I mean, you name it. And I just don't think this is only my subjective opinion. I just think if you look at things like the ad load that you are expected to undergo for a Google search now versus 10 or 15 years ago, it's a totally different story. So a monopolist will tend to charge more for the same product over time. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing as we allow domination of the internet by just a few big companies.
Tim, thank you so much for your time.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
A big thank you to Tim for his time and insights. You can get all of our great economic coverage on Reuters.com and the Reuters app. Now for that quiz. I asked you to tell me which of the following companies is an inheritor to J.D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil. Is it A, Chevron, B, ExxonMobil, or C, ConocoPhillips? And the answer? All three. Standard Oil was so big that it spawned lots of America's biggest oil companies. After the breakup, Chevron was originally known as Standard Oil of California. ExxonMobil was Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, and ConocoPhillips was called the Continental Oil Company. This is Reuters Econ World. Every week we go deep on the economic principles and ideas driving the biggest news around the world. If you want to tell us what you thought of this week's show, just drop us a line in the comment section of your favourite podcast platform. You can also reach out to me on LinkedIn. This episode was produced by Ethan Plotkin and Eliza Davis-Beard. Sound design, music composition and engineering was by Josh Summer and Sebastian Summer. Our executive producer is Leela de Kretzer. Remember, for all your daily news, check out our Reuters World News show. You can catch it on the Reuters app or wherever you listen to your podcast.